Big tech.
Big tech.
Big tech.
If you look at the big tech companies, they have gotten large enough that they're going to be inspected.
Welcome to 21st Century Empires. In this film, I'm going to be presenting ideas from Lorenzo Veracini's Settler Colonialism, a theoretical overview, in order to explain how the behavior of big tech actors in the realms of both personal data extraction and privately funded space pursuits reflects a new iteration of settler colonialism that is specific to the 21st century. Additionally, this film is going to feature interviews with several experts in order to further dive into the subject at hand. That includes Dr. Movindri Reddy from Occidental College, who is an expert in international political processes and colonial studies, Dr. Michael Quett, who is a visiting fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project and a published expert in digital colonialism, and last but not least, Dr. Namratha Goswami, who co-authored a book called Scramble for the Skies, The Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space, and is an expert in both space policy and conflict resolution. Lastly, this project is going to be split into 3 different parts in order to explain how the behavior of big tech players in both personal data extraction and private space exploration can be applied to 3 specific principles regarding settler colonialism. It goes without saying that in the 21st century, we have seen the rise of technology unlike anything before in human history. And one thing that modern technology has been a catalyst for is the entry of 2 new natural resources into the global economy that up until this moment in time, no one had ever really assumed would be extremely viable and profitable commodities. The first of those being personal data, and the second being space-based resources.
Colonialism, in many ways, starts because of market capitalism. It's the logic behind it is that most entities need something else in order to continue to be competitive. In the case of colonialism, historical colonialism, it was to produce raw materials.
In places where mobile data is expensive, much of the developing world, Facebook started partnering with local telecoms a few years ago, offering an app it had built called Free Basics. That gives people a stripped-down version of Facebook and a few other sites for free without having to pay for data. Developing markets in Africa, Latin America, and Asia-Pacific got on board.
I think everybody in the room needs to remember, as an individual or a company, there's nothing for free. So if you're getting a free service for sharing your data, that's because the data is more valuable than what you would pay for it.
There's a new land grab going on, but it's not land that's being grabbed, it's us. It's human life, the acquisition, the construction of data, valuable data for corporate use, out of the flow of our lives. That's the land grab going on, and that's why the word colonialism is the only word that does justice to that.
Even though it's not a settler colonialism where a bunch of people show up on a foreign land and displace people, murder them, take over their physical territory, that doesn't need to be done anymore. Really, the exploitation is being done, in the domain of the digital world is through colonization of the knowledge and the means of computation, right? So you don't need to colonize the land, you're taking over the technologies and the knowledge to be able to produce the most valuable stuff in the global economy. If you look at some of the justifications for colonialism in India, to this day, you'll see a trope, kind of bandied about, saying that, well, we built the railroads in India. And you can see some people saying similar things about Facebook and some of these companies that are providing these services, in the sense they're just saying, well, but at least we're connecting the world's people, at least we're providing them with, technologies to do the things we do on these platforms. But if you look at the way these technologies were built, they were built for the purpose of the companies that built them, and they were designed in that fashion. Now, you had said early that this is kind of an invisible thing. So you can see with railroads, you can look from a bird's eye view and see where they go, and that they come back down to the ports, for extraction. You can, if you're also looking at a second form of infrastructure, the panopticon. There's I've seen some pictures from a journal article on the use of panoptic structures for housing compounds in South Africa, where they were doing mining. So what they did is they organized these mining compounds in a panoptic structure, and they were putting Africans to, under heavy labor to extract the metals out of the ground. And so they brought them into these basically labor camps, and they would be housed in them, and they wanted to maintain control over them. So they physically designed them as a panopticon. And that allowed them to keep control over the movements and the laborers that were being housed there. Now, if you look at something like Facebook, you don't see the way it's built, but it's built as a middleman. It's a centralized middleman, and because when I communicate over Facebook, let's say I want to share a picture, I upload it to Facebook, and then somebody who's a friend of mine will download it, and they download it from Facebook's server. Basically, everything is going through Facebook. And it doesn't have to be that way. That we can actually, and we do have, some real world examples of less panoptic social networking where the system is decentralized. But there's also technologies that are being built that really heavily decentralize the sharing of data so that it's more of a peer-to-peer architecture. So there are design alternatives to the way we could do social networking, but it's not beneficial to somebody like Facebook, who has an interest in gathering as much data as they can about people, about being that man in the middle, the guard, the prison guard in the middle of the panopticon, and seeing what everybody's up to, and then monetizing that data by sending out, say, ads to people. And so, in this sense, the way these things are designed reflects the interests of the owners who are trying to profit out of them, not merely trying to give a service to people. And it could be done differently.
If you look at estimates, when you include space-based resources, for example, resources from the moon and a small asteroid like 3554 Amum, which has the capability of returning about $20 trillion of investment, it's a very, very large sum. And I think that's the reason why your project gets so interesting, because today the conversations are no more determined by the Cold War set regulatory frameworks, like the Outer Space Treaty, which was a lot about limiting human activity in space for fear of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. So the philosophy and the context of the Outer Space Treaty was not about enabling human exploration of space. It was about limiting both the US and the USSR's capability to use space for purposes of war. So the context is very different. So and so today, given the fact that space is seen from an economic perspective, which was not the case in the 1960s, there is very serious study coming out of NASA, including China's National Space Administration, that talks about about $10 trillion return of investment by 2050 annually, just from the moon. So I think this is the reason why we have such a scramble for the skies, if I may, in the context of today.
The only way that I can see to deploy this much financial resource is by converting my Amazon winnings into space travel. So that's basically, Blue Origin is expensive enough to be able to use that fortune.
Welcome to Blue Origin. Today we are building human-capable, reusable rockets. We can kind of move humanity and heavy industry off of Earth so we can preserve this planet. Our vision is millions of people living and working in space.
We want to unlock for humanity the ability to use resources on the moon, of the sun, the asteroids, and all of this. Perhaps human history in the past, whenever we found something new, we've actually just found new things to fight about. Our vision of the future is perhaps a little bit more optimistic.
If we attempt to make a self-sustaining base, self-sustaining civilization on the moon or Mars, that is enormous opportunity on probably the $1 trillion level, because then you got basically interplanetary commerce going on. I think that's pretty huge.
Say, for example, you have a planetary mining company that has invested in its 3D printing and extraction capability, has been able to get to the moon and has established shop there. There is the possibility that if there is another company, say from another country, that has developed that particular capability and lands there, given the fact that we lack regulatory mechanisms to deal with that situation, it could lead to confrontation and dispute. The Outer Space Treaty states that in case there is any kind of dispute of that order that creates dissension or anxiety, consultation process has to be established between states. But then we are talking about private entities who can go rogue as well and declare themselves independent, right? So it is very possible that it could lead to confrontation and conflict.
They will insist on being sovereign in order to continue to thrive in the foreign land, right? And that includes politics, economics, social well-being of people within it, and so on.
I've always wondered, why was there such successful and strong defiance of free basics in India, but not many other places, including, where I do my work in South Africa. But it was impressive what they did, and they did it, of course, pushing back on the concept that Facebook is violating net neutrality.
So net neutrality is this idea that all data on the internet should be accessible equally. So an example of that is your internet provider is not allowed to make one website load faster than another in order to skew the market and shift people towards whichever website they are prioritizing. And how that kind of plays into the free basics program is that by only offering a limited number of websites, it immediately monopolizes those sites within their respective fields. So for example, by only giving people access to Facebook and WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, it is violating net neutrality by giving people an internet access where they can't access other forms of social networking, but only ones that are provided for and created by Facebook.
So the Facebook is misleading the people, telling that the free basics gives internet to poor people. But we have to understand that the free basic is providing internet to poor people, and it is accessible only for the few websites, not the exact internet. So the net neutrality, they are spoiling the net neutrality definition. The free basics has to provide the internet in which they should be able to access all the websites, not just the only limited version of the internet. And they are violating the net neutrality, and that's the reason we are here and protesting. So that the free basics give access to all the websites equally, and gives access to all the websites, not just the limited websites.
What free basics represents the ability to distort free and fair competition on the web, and that legitimately is where the Competition Commission and competition law kicks in.
Facebook's zero-rated mobile service called Free Basics has been having some issues in India for months now over net neutrality violations. Now the country's regulator has banned Free Basics and other services like it.
Essentially, colonist independence is rooted in this reality that the settler will play by their own rules when in new territories in order to achieve their ambitions. So in the case of Free Basics, the program clearly violates net neutrality to the point where it sparked a counter movement in India that ultimately led to the program being banned from the country. So Facebook's deliberate refusal to abide by net neutrality regulations reflects an assumed independence from the governing bodies that are supposed to have authority over the private sector. So in this way, we can see Facebook acting as an independent entity, an independent settler, one who does not have to hear from the regulations of higher bodies in the digital realm and in their pursuit to acquire more users for data extraction.
The concept of moving away as a separate entity from the metropole is extremely important and is likely to happen.
So historically, the metropole is defined as the parent state of a settler colony. So within the context of the United States, early colonies like Jamestown, their metropole was Great Britain. So if we're going to apply that concept to space colonies pursued by companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX, their metropole would be the country that these companies are registered in and launched from. And with regard to those two examples, that would be the United States.
In terms of this project where you're looking at these very powerful tech companies that are in the forefront of moving this whole field forward and engaging in exploration and so on. In some ways, these tech companies are acting like sovereign entities. Right? They are powerful. In fact, some people could make the argument that they're more powerful than states. And, we can get into the details of that. But because they act as sovereign entities and they choose the people based on the data they have collected, they choose the settlers who are going to settle in these entities. The assumption is that they will act like the metropole. They will act as that powerful group that is going to decide on how these communities are formed and who controls them and the amount of surveillance that's going on and so on. And so this creates instantly a dynamic that is inherently challenging, right? Because the settlers begin to formulate their own identities, and yet the metropole continues to believe that they have ultimate control. So this really has parallels with actual settler colonialism that has occurred in the world, globally throughout the world.
Mars might one aspire to be getting out of Earth control or Earth regulatory laws, but the United States is obligated to the Outer Space Treaty, and it's a ratified treaty signed by the United States, that any private entity that launches from US soil have to come under US national space law and have to be regulated. So his aspiration is one thing, but it is very clear in terms of which state has the regulatory framework. In case a disaster happens, the launch state and the state to which, say, Starship is registered is liable to any other damage caused, say, to another country's mission. So my take would be that as of today, if you look at the space regulatory and governance mechanisms, including the Liability Convention, the Rescue Convention and the Outer Space Treaty, SpaceX and any other private actor comes under US law, and that is an obligation that the United States have to meet. Now, the challenge to this is, of course, that if Musk succeeds in getting to Mars, and take along with him a group of people or a group of people with sustainable, supply chains, or let's take a scenario where he establishes a colony and then he establishes a self-government and is able to supply his own raw material without being dependent on Earth. Then the question comes, okay, he's still under Earth regulatory regime, but the question is, who is going to enforce that regulatory regime? Because you do not have the enforceable law enforcement body that's going to be able to impose the law. We don't have it today. The Space Force is not equipped to, go after Musk. He's the only one with the capability to go there with human beings once Starship succeeds and is able to refuel itself. So that's the challenge we have today. But the interesting point is that what happens if China recognizes that claim? So China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and just on March 9th, China and Russia signed a cooperation agreement for lunar development, and they might actually cooperate on Mars itself. So there will be consideration, there will be challenges to that particular stance by Musk, but it's a scenario. I'm glad you're actually looking at it, because not many people think about these scenarios through. And my response would be that we still don't know. We haven't come, because if you look at historically, the country we are living in, the United States, it declared itself independent of the United Kingdom. There were colonies and settler colonies that decided that the United Kingdom was not good for them. They were being taxed. They declared independence, and they actually established a democratic system. And the repercussions of that wasn't as high, right? Because of the age of colonialism at that time. Today, of course, there'll be conversations around the Outer Space Treaty, but again, what happens if a country actually recognizes them? That will create much more, difficult legal questions to be posed. Bezos, since the age of 12, has had this inspiration from Jared O'Neill for the Final Frontier book, where he talks about establishing, habitats, the O'Neillian colonies.
What O'Neill and his students came up with was the idea of manufactured worlds, rotated to create artificial gravity with centrifugal force. These are very large structures, miles on end, and they hold 1 million people or more each.
China does not have an independent judiciary. So it's a judiciary that is, always bowing down to the Communist Party of China and would not do anything that contradicts that. So in that context, any Chinese space startup or company has to behave in a manner that is guided by that overall philosophy of state control. And so it's very difficult for them to behave otherwise.
I also want to add that the Chinese government has a history of blurring the lines between the public and private sector, with a prime example of that being Huawei. Although the company has publicly declared that they're a private organization, in a study done by Christopher Balding, he found that the company is essentially a public trade union under the control of the National People's Congress. As the space economy continues to grow, I don't think it'd be surprising to see a private space company emerge from China that is actually a vehicle for the state. This reality might actually already be underway, as Pony Ma, who is the CEO and founder of Tencent and WeChat, which has been leading China's private investment into the space sector, has been reported by the Wall Street Journal to be a member of the National People's Congress and have close ties to the Chinese Communist Party.
So they created these narratives as if the land was empty and that it was, that it could be conquered. It was there to be conquered. So I think I think that enabled colonialism in many ways. The other piece that I find interesting in the comparison with your explorations in space is this idea that the settlers themselves brought these concepts, Western concepts with them, right? And one of them was this idea of religion, bringing civilization to these dark spaces. So the idea was bringing light to these dark spaces. So, and the way in which they defined these dark spaces were that they were relatively uncivilized because people in there had not conquered their environment, and they appeared it appeared as though the environment, the fauna and flora, were had dominated people rather than the other way around, as in Western culture. So there was this idea that they were also bringing in the light into this space. And I guess the last one is that there's this idea. I mean, it has the similar connotations with the big tech companies, because there's this notion that not only were settlers capable of bringing in these new ideologies and new ways of taming an environment, but they also had these capacities of intelligence and wherewithal and the abilities that local people did not have. So there was a hierarchy in terms of all of those elements. So yes, it's very similar to this idea of moving into the unknown and colonizing it. It has very similar connotations.
If you're going to look at the old way that that colonizers impose their economic systems, I would say that it's also the case, most certainly, that these Western corporations are imposing their economies. And if you want to see it in almost religious terms, because it's not a metaphysical, religious or, a philosophical religious orientation, but there is definitely a kind of gospel of big tech about what it can do for society and an ideology there. They're most certainly imposing that on the world. And so if you're looking at something like Free Basics, being pushed into a place like South Africa or elsewhere in the global South. In a certain sense, they are pushing their economic model because they are pushing their service out there and people are basically assimilating into it.
Technology can increase connections, can bring new life-saving mechanisms to local communities. There's many positives associated with bringing technology into Indigenous communities. So I think it will be foolish to assume that it's all bad. However, one of the most important elements that existed in much of, the former colonies throughout the world was that many societies practice a communal type of system, right? It's a system whereby everyone depends on each other in order to survive. So there's this notion that whatever you do and in whatever capacity you do it in, whether you're a youngster or an elder in the community, whatever you do, you are working to sustain the community as an entity. When we introduce technology and we do it in the way in which we're doing it now, which is not gradual, but it's a very, very drastic introduction into a system, what happens is that this notion of individualism then really, is introduced into the Indigenous communities, and it comes up against these very strong alliances associated with a communal lifestyle. And I think this for me is one of the most, tricky implications of introducing this technology.
That if we move out into the solar system, for all practical purposes, we have unlimited resources. So, we get to choose. Do we want stasis and rationing? Or do we want dynamism and growth? This is an easy choice. We know what we want. We just have to get busy. If we're out in the solar system, we can have 1 trillion humans in the solar system, which means we'd have 1,000 Mozarts and 1,000 Einsteins. This would be an incredible civilization.
I think there are really two fundamental paths. History is going to bifurcate along two directions. One path is we stay on Earth forever, and then there will be some eventual extinction event. I don't have an immediate doomsday prophecy, but eventually history suggests there will be some doomsday event. The alternative is to become a spacefaring civilization and a multi-planet species, which I hope you would agree that is the right way to go. Yes? That's what we want. Starting obviously with one ship, then multiple ships, then start building out the city, then making the city bigger, even bigger. And over time, terraforming Mars and making it really a nice place to be.
But how practical is it to have entire companies dedicated to advancing human civilization in space?
If you look at the mandate of space companies like Blue Origin or SpaceX, and the workforce, it's a very diverse workforce, international to a large extent as well. Migrants working in these companies. So in that context, Bezos and Musk are the face of that company, or the creators of an ideology of expansion. So if you listen to their conversations carefully, including their, interviews, their exposition of their philosophy, it's a lot about enabling human beings to have better lives and to safeguard Earth, right? I would imagine a company funded by the Communist Party of China, for example, China space program, will have a very different philosophy. They have a first come, first serve philosophy when you look at their behavior on Earth, including the South China Sea, where they claim areas which are rich in resources but are disputed by other countries, but then they unilaterally develop islands without even consulting the disputant countries. So that is why I think it is very important for us today to establish regulatory frameworks that ensures that we do not repeat that particular, colonial, historical context.
If you're something like Facebook right now, data is, there is their oil for sure, because they're selling out targeted advertisements. But it should be noted that beyond that, if things change one day, because privacy activism and new laws and things like that, that they can change their tactics here. The ultimate goal for them is to make sure that the money comes into their own hands and not somebody else. And so yes, data colonialism is part of this broader digital colonialism process. And it's at this moment in history, data has a major role for a lot of what the tech ecosystem is about.
When we equate what happened during the colonial period to what is happening today, we are forgetting that during the colonial period, we did not have the communication revolution. We did not have democratic governments at that time as established as it is today. None of the companies we are talking about who talk about going to those areas are imperial companies serving the queen or under a monarchy. They have a very different political culture that they have grown up. Elon Musk himself is a migrant from South Africa, a citizen of South Africa, Canada, and the United States, grown up in a democratic society. So in that context, I would say that there would be the proclivity to establish dispute resolution and mechanisms. The colonial period is a historical example we should be concerned about that we do not repeat. But the context of today is so different from, say, 200 years ago.
This film has explained how ideas from Lorenzo Veracini's Settler Colonialism, a theoretical overview, can be applied to the behavior of big tech players in the realms of both personal data extraction and private space exploration. That includes the relationship between settler colonialism and capitalism, the idea of colonist independence, and the settler gaze, which is the perception of bringing light into dark. The argument in this film isn't intended to imply that this iteration of settler colonialism is on par with that of historical colonialism, as the horrific degrees of violence that were so essential to historical colonialism are not a part of this picture. Personal data and space-based resources are both commodities that can be acquired through non-violent means. That being said, I think a takeaway from this project is just how influential big tech players have become, and in many ways they have become their own geopolitical force. In their pursuit to acquire more users for data extraction and to take humanity into space, big tech players have truly become 21st century empires.